In this video, we'll discuss numerical measures of relative standing. The first two examples we'll talk about are percentile rankings and quartiles. Some important terminology to talk about is, first, measures of relative standing. Measures of relative standing are descriptive measures of the relationship of a measurement to the rest of the data. So we often think about GPAs or SAT or ACT scores as examples of relative standing. We use percentile ranking as a measure of relative standing that describe what percent of data falls above and below a given measurement. So the percentiles are often used in education or the health-related fields to indicate how one individual compares with others in a group. The pth percentile for any set of n measurements is arranged in ascending or descending order. The pth percentile is a number such that p% of the measurements fall below that number and 100 minus p% fall above it. Again, we can use SAT scores as an example. So if your SAT score is at the 64th percentile, that represents 36% of scores were above your score, while 64% of scores were below your score. One way to think about this is draw yourself a horizontal line representing from 0 percentile to 100 percentile. In the middle, we would have our 50th percentile. Remember, the 50th percentile represents the median of our data. 50% of measurements fall above the median, and 50% of the measurements would fall below the median. So if we look back to our SAT score, 64th percentile would fall to the right of 50% because it's higher. So that might be where the 64th percentile falls. So if we look at the 64th percentile for the SAT score, that means we're looking at 64 to 100. That would be 100 minus 64, or 36% of students scored above our score. In the other direction, 64 back to 0%, 64% fall below our score. Looking at quartiles for our measurements, we have the lower quartile and the upper quartile, and the middle quartile is known as the median. The lower quartile is represented as Q sub L, and that is the 25th percentile of the data set. Middle quartile, M, is our median, that's the 50th percentile, and the upper quartile is represented with Q sub U, that is the 75th percentile. Let's look at an example of how this is used. Our first reference for class material, number 1, says for a quantitative data set, what is the 50th percentile called? And you may recall that that is the middle quartile, or known as the median of the data. We often represent this with a capital M on a box plot. To define the lower quartile, Q sub L, that is the 25th percentile of the data set. So using our straight line, we would have from 0 to 100, cutting that in half with the median. The lower quartile would cut in half from 0 to 50, so that would make the 25th percentile. That means 25% of the data falls to the left of that lower quartile, while from 75 to 100 represents 75% of the measurements fall above the lower quartile. And finally, to define the upper quartile, this is the 75th percentile of the data set. So with our straight line, we're thinking from 0% to 100%. Again, halfway would be our median, representing the 50th percentile. So the upper quartile cuts in half from 50 to 100. That would be 75th percentile. From 75 to 100, that leaves 25% of the measurements falling above. And from 75 back to 0, that would be 75% of the measurements falling below.